In the West Indies, the colonizers faced a few challenges that made it impractical to establish a system of social control using whites as the buffer class or the middlemen to oppress the slaves. And we're going to address some of these challenges in this video. But ultimately, the ruling class colonizers, in their quest for power and for profits, they had to resort to who they called the colored people to act in this role as the middlemen, right? And we're also going to address this as well. And so for us to do that, we're going to read from this book here called The Invention of the White Race. This is volume 2 by historian Theodore Allen. And so let's go in here and turn to page 226, where it says this. In relation to the question of social control and the invention of the white race, the British West Indies differed from the continental plantation colonies in 5 significant ways. The continental plantations are the ones on the mainland USA, like Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, and so forth. And so Allen says social control using the idea of the white race, it differed in the West Indies, which includes countries like Jamaica and Barbados, from the continental plantation in 5 significant ways, which are these. First, because of the narrow absolute limitations of land area and the relatively high capital cost of sugar production, the West Indies was especially inhospitable to non-capitalist farmers or tenants. Second, in the West Indies, the attempt to establish a white race social control system was seriously and critically complicated by the substantial Irish presence. Third, the central role of the English military and naval forces regularly stationed in the West Indies constituted the most important guarantor of social control. Fourth, the predominance of persons of African descent in the populations of the West Indies made it impossible to exclude them altogether from the intermediate stratum, which we're going to talk about later on. Fifth, the reliance upon persons of African descent in the skilled trades and in the conduct of the internal economy of the West Indies colonies led to the emergence of the free colored as the predominant element in the middle class. So these points are what Allen concludes to be the factors that prevented the white race from being established as an effective means of social control in the West Indies. And we're going to deal with a few of these points to see why. We're going to address the Irish presence and then the ultimate decision to take some of those of African descent and use them as the middlemen within these West Indian societies, right? So let's start by discussing the European presence in the West Indies, right? And we're starting off beginning in the 1600s. That's the setting. So keep that in mind. Here we go. Immigration became a major concern of the West Indies colonial authorities, not on account of the loss of labor power it represented, but because of the difficulty in maintaining the militia for defense against rival colonial powers, particularly the French, and for purposes of social control of the bond laborers. So not enough Europeans were immigrating to the West Indies to defend the English colonies from their rivals and also to control the laborers. So this presented some obvious problems. Let's continue. The European population of Barbados in 1640 was around 25,000. Of these, more than 1/3 were proprietors or landowners, and 10,000 were servants, while the non-European bond laborers, including a few Armoridians, numbered 6,400. By 1680, the total number of Europeans had fallen to 17,000, and because of the cost of capital and land requirements for sugar planting, the number of considerable proprietors was less than 500, and the number of European bond laborers in the island had shrunk to 2,000. Now remember, it was 10,000 servants in 1640, but in 1680 it had dropped to only 2,000. And that's because the cost was too high for anyone but the most well-to-do people to afford any of the land, right? In many of the cases, the European laborers, they just picked up and left right after their term of service was completed. Let's continue going. In the 1660s, Barbados had a fighting force of only 7,000 men, of whom only the large landholders were interested in the colony enough to be ready to defend it. The rest were concerned only with immigrating to find better prospects than they could have in Barbados. Harlow's conclusion regarding Barbados was generally applicable to the British West Indies. It was the concentration of land into large estates which was gradually depriving Barbados of her yeoman class, or the middle class, and which eventually put an end to her development as a white community. Social control was aimed at bond laborers, whether of European or African descent. Now, what is social control? That means restricting the behavior of the society so it can conform to a certain set of values and practices, and basically keeping everyone in line and functioning within particular roles, right? And so the colonists, they had goals of making profits on their minds. And so they needed to create a society that functioned in that way to produce profits for them, right? And so they needed people to play certain roles and a system of control to keep people playing those roles, right? And to minimize them doing anything outside of those roles. And that's where you get the black and white identities coming in, right? And that's why you, when we go through many of these videos, you see them changing a lot of the laws. They were tweaking the environment to set it up in a way to make themselves powerful and profitable, right? That was their social control objective. And it was originally aimed at both laborers of European and African descent, as Alan said. Now let's continue. But the limited term bond laborers who, in the West Indies, were exclusively European were prospective enlistees in the social control system as members of the militia, provided they survived their terms of servitude. So they had an opportunity to move into the militia ranks, which was not originally available to those of African descent, which tells us that the rulers had some plot to keep them at the bottom of society. Let's continue. This was a scheme for a class collaboration of Europeans that required a new term of social distinction, namely white, that would include not only laborers and capitalists, but also bond labor as well as free labor. The white identity was the umbrella term that they wanted all the Europeans to buy into, no matter what their class was. And that's because they needed to find a way to get these lower level laboring Europeans to feel united with them, right? So they could be more easily used as pawns in the game. Here we go. The alternative or redundant term Christian was sometimes applied to European bond laborers, despite complications that arose regarding the Christian conversion of African bond laborers. So the Christian term had problems because those of African descent could be converted to Christianity, and many of them were. And you may ask, what's the problem with that? The problem is they needed an identity that would exclude all of those of African descent, right? Because those are the people that they were plotting on to keep them at the bottom. And the Christian identity couldn't serve that purpose, but the white identity could. Let's continue. Or from the belief that some Europeans, namely the Irish, though Europeans, had yet to be made Christians. It became customary also to use the term servants for the European bond laborers, potential militiamen, as distinct from African lifetime bond laborers, called slaves. A succession of proposals, schemes, and laws were proposed, some of them adopted, that were explicitly aiming at increasing the proportion of the militia-producing European population in the English West Indies, or at least maintaining it. Compulsory measures were undertaken, of which the most general type imposed fines on plantation owners who failed to keep in their employ a quota of one European, bond or free, for every so many African bond laborers. These were the so-called deficiency laws. So we can see by these deficiency laws that they had a clear plan in mind for that society. And part of that plan was to use these lower level European laborers as lower level oppressors to the West Indian slaves of African descent. Let's continue. The ratio varied from place to place and from time to time. Whatever the particular ratio, the home government constantly expressed its concern that it be met. And this is what the governing class did to ensure that it was met. In 1682 in Jamaica, the quota was one white bond laborer to the first 5 lifetime bond laborers. For 10 slaves, 2 whites. And for every 10 slaves over and above the said number, 1 white, on penalty of £5 for every servant that shall be wanting. And so they used the tool of the law to impose a fine on the plantation owners who were found not to be within the bounds of the law. And what is the purpose of the fine, right? It has a twofold purpose. One, it's meant to influence people to act in a certain way to avoid punishment, right? And two, it's an easy means of collecting money from people for them not following the rules, right? So the people who impose the fines, they win either way. Let's continue. In 1699, the governor of the Leeward Island was instructed to use his utmost endeavor that each planter keep such a number of white servants as the law directed. The Nevis Assembly in 1701 passed an act for encouraging the importation of white servants, and that all persons shall be obliged to keep one white servant to every 20 Negroes. Other compulsory measures were designed to limit immigration, meaning Europeans leaving the island and then going somewhere else. For example, English prisoners who had been sentenced to 10 years servitude in Barbados for the 1685 rebellion led by the Duke of Monmouth were ordered to be freed from bond servitude, but they were forbidden to leave the island without royal permission. In the 1660s, the usual term of servitude in Barbados was reduced to encourage bond laborers to come to the island. In order to get and keep European craftsmen in Barbados, the island's assembly prohibited the employment of Africans and Afro-Barbadians as coopers, smiths, carpenters, tailors, or boatmen. And so we can see they were trying all types of tactics to entice the laboring Europeans to stay and remain. And for what reason? Was it to make friends and to become drinking buddies? No, it was to keep them there and to use them as militiamen to protect the colony, and also to use them as the middlemen to oppress the slaves and to keep them at the bottom. Let's read on. In 1695, Governor Russell of Barbados remarked on the deplorable condition of the European former bond laborers, who were domineered over and used like dogs. Such treatment, he believed, would drive away the commonality of the white people. And this is exactly the point that Lerone Bennett Jr. makes in his book, The Shaping of Black America, that the European servant was treated no better than the slave, right? And this is what the governor of Barbados is basically reporting in 1695. And he's concerned that this treatment would basically prevent them from wanting to identify as a unified white people. Let's get some more. There were hundreds of such unfortunates, he declared, that never enjoyed fresh meat nor a dram of rum. That woeful lack could be made up, he suggested, by reducing the property qualifications for voting at the annual elections in the expectation that candidates for the assembly would sometimes give the miserable creatures a little rum and fresh provisions, as such things would be of nourishment and make their lives more comfortable in hopes of getting their votes. You see that? Look how they're plotting on people. Let's continue. In 1709, a merchant trading to Jamaica proposed to the commissioners of trade and plantations the settling of a colony of German Protestants in that island, because the European militia was reduced to 2,500 and there were 40,000 African bond laborers to be repressed or kept in the pit. Uh-oh. Now there was becoming a big problem because there was only 2,500 European militiamen in 1709, and there was 40,000 West Indians of African descent who they needed to keep in the pits of slavery, right? So they advised to get German Protestants to come in and fill that role. And here's the rest of that proposal. This is what it says. These settlers were to be free so soon as they set foot on shore in that island and enjoy all privileges. They were to be granted 5 or 6 acres of land in fee simple for every member of each family. You see that? Freedom as soon as they stepped foot on the island, and 5 or 6 acres of land to every member of the family. These were the proposed incentives. Now here we go. 6 years later, the Lords of Trade and Plantations proposed that all Protestant European immigrants be extended those privileges on arrival in Jamaica. Suggestions were advanced that, voluntarily or otherwise, the great plantation owners should surrender title to a small portion of their land to European ex-bond laborers. But that notion came to naught because of a lack of sufficient support from the prospective donors. So some of the greedy landowners were just unwilling to give up any land at all, and this is what happened. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The land would remain in the ownership of the capitalist owner, but they would allow a few acres to be occupied by European tenants without any rent or other obligation except that of service in the militia. So they wouldn't give them the land, but they would let them stay on a few acres and use it as long as they served in the military on that island. Let's continue. Properly called military tenants, these men represented the ultimate stage in the evolution of whiteness. Their contribution to the economic life of the colony was negligible to non-existent, and there was no other rationale for their existence except the political one of serving as a ready reserve for social control over bond laborers. And that's all they needed them for, to play the role of keeping all those in the pit who dared to rise up. Let's continue. For especially meritorious services in the war against external or internal enemies, some such men might be given ownership of African bond laborers. The result, however, was not an enhancement of their participation in the economic activity of the colony, but merely provided a means of making the military tenants more comfortable in their shiftless existence. In token of their acquired status as whites, even European bond laborers were by law protected against excessive correction by their owners. But by and large, such encouragement failed to convince European laborers to come and to remain in the West Indies in the numbers that were necessary for the establishing of a civil regime of racial oppression. In time, the propertyless majority of the European population of the British West Indies would be assigned to a special category, socially and economically marginalized as poor whites. The policy designated by the plantation bourgeoisie to enlist laboring class Europeans as whites in a social control stratum against Africans occasionally encountered manifestations of the contrary normal tendency of European and African bond laborers to make common cause against their owners. Such events were a challenge to the establishment of the new all-class, all-European white identity. Now watch who was on the list of creating some of these all-white identity problems. Here we go. It was the behavior of many of the Irish bond laborers that created the greatest breach in that concept. It's always the wild Irish who didn't want to get with the program. Let's continue. The Caribbean was a cockpit of European colonial rivalry. Over a period of 80 years from 1667 to 1748, the region was involved in 4 formal wars in which England was aligned against one or more Catholic powers, primarily France, but also Spain. This period coincided with much of the tragic English conquest of Ireland and Ireland's subjection under the most extreme period of the racial oppression under the anti-popery penal laws. And Allen goes over this in great detail in Volume 1, where he shows how the English were using these oppressive strategies against the Irish in the form of religion, right, and laws. And the English were primarily Protestant, and the Irish were primarily Catholics. And so the English, they used these anti-Catholic or anti-popery laws to try to drag the Irish down into the dungeon. Let's continue. In this period, Catholic Irish bond laborers, who constituted a major proportion of the European bond laborers in British West Indies, were often disposed to ally their cause with any challenge to British authority, whether that challenge were made by African bond laborers or by a rival colonial power. And so the English make up part of the British, and so the Irish used any opportunity to rise up and go against the British, whether it was with other colonial powers or if it was with the those of African descent, right? It didn't matter. Let's continue. In November 1655, following the Cromwellian conquest, when the Irish slave trade was at its fullest, the Barbados Colony Council was apprised that there are several Irish servants and Negroes out in rebellion in the thickets and thereabouts, ready to get busy at any moment. And so the Negro and the Irish, they were out there hiding in the bushes, prepared to go upside someone's head, right? Out of rebellion. And if I was there during this time, I'm telling you right now, I would have been one of those that were out in the thickets, ready to rebel, right? Some of you watching also would have been out there in the thickets as well, while the majority of other people were sitting back and just accepting their circumstances, right? But that surely wasn't the case with these Negroes and the wild Irish that were out in the thickets, right? Ready to rebel. Let's continue going. 2 years later, the Barbados General Assembly warned that Irish men and women were wandering about the island pretending to be free, some of whom had endeavored to secure with arms, and others now forth in rebellion. You see that? These are the problems that they were having with these Irish, right? Here we go. During the War of Devolution, in which the French captured and held St. Kitts for 2 years, 1666 through 1667, decisive roles were played by French Negroes who burned 6 strong English forts on the island's north coast, and by the Irish on the island who rose against the English planters and joined the French. Now watch what the governor said here. Watch this. In 1667, Governor William Willoughby of Barbados wrote to King Charles II that of a possible fighting force of 4,000, what with blacks, Irish, and servants, I cannot rely upon more than between 2,000 and 3,000 men. And so he didn't have enough men to back himself up against the fighting force that consisted of both the blacks and the Irish, right? Ready to thump and get busy. Let's continue. In March 1668, it was reported that Barbados had contributed so many men to help retake the Leeward Islands from the French that it was in an ill condition in regards to the multitude of Negroes and Irish servants, which is much superior to the rest of the planters and inhabitants. Citing 5 entries in the Great Britain Calendar of State Papers, Colonial, Gwynn documents Irish insurrection against the English in the battles for the Leeward Islands in 1689. Although the law enacted on Nevis forbidding servants and slaves to company or drink together did not specifically mention the Irish, it is reasonable to believe they were among the usual suspects. In the 1692 plot to capture the Barbados fort, Irish bond laborers undertook a special tactical role. By guile or by force, they were to open the doors of the fort to the Negro rebels. The Negroes were getting busy out there too, we can see. Here we go. 2 laws were enacted by the Nevis Assembly on 21st December 1701. One to prevent Papists and reputed Papists from settling in the island, which targeted all the Catholics, but specifically the Irish. And the second for encouraging the importation of white servants, meaning all the whites who were not Catholic, which excluded most of the Irish. And so everything that we just went over right now is what the colonial rulers were trying to set up in the West Indies for their system of social control. But did it work? Let's find out. By the end of the 17th century, the 1600s, the old system of defense by white servants had broken down, writes military historian John W. Fortescue. So it did not work, which is why they had to abandon that plan and come up with something else, which was this. Because of the breakdown, the system of social control by European bond laborers and former bond laborers, a new concept and composition for an intermediate social control stratum that included persons of African ancestry was contrived. Since the European laborers didn't work out as the middleman as was planned, the colonial rulers made adjustments, right? And they came up with another plan. And what was part of that plan was to take some of those of African descent and use them as the middlemen. Pay attention right now because it's about to get real spicy. Here we go. When the former bond laborers in Virginia tried to start farming on their own, or small planters lost out to creditors, they did not embark for another country. They took their hoes and axes and headed for North Carolina or Maryland, or the Piedmont, or even farther westward. Whatever the extent of migration may have been, the European American population on every continental plantation colony, according to the present best estimate, grew absolutely decade by decade from a combined total of 71,847 in 1700 to 734,754 in 1780. Although the European American proportion of the population of the plantation colonies declined from 84% to 59%, only in South Carolina had it been reduced to less than half, to 46%. So the Europeans were the majority of the population on the mainland USA. This is the point that he's making. And they were increasing. Here we go. In the British West Indies, on the other hand, Euro-Caribbeans were a minority population before the end of the 17th century. Barbados had a higher proportion of European descent inhabitants than any other colony in British West Indies. Yet by 1713 in Barbados, and in the Leeward Islands as well, Europeans made up only 1/4 of the population. In Jamaica, the ratio was only 1 in 9. You see how low they were in numbers? This is all tying into the reason why they ended up using those of recent African descent to be the new oppressor group. Now, here we go. In obvious acknowledgement of the absolute impossibility that the militia providing former bond laborers would ever become viable yeoman farmers or middlemen farmers, various laws were enacted to preserve other petite bourgeoisie opportunities for them. By excluding non-Europeans from engaging in skilled occupations or huckstering, which is like peddling, small level peddling. But in the end, the purpose of such measures, which were absolutely essential to the meaning of white, were nullified by the economic advantage of the use of African bond laborers in skilled and lower supervisory occupations on the plantations, and by the valuable service to the internal market provided by African bond laborers, particularly the women. In time, as a result of emancipation by self-purchase, by testaments of free owner fathers, and in reward for special service, as well as by natural increase, a population of free persons of some degree of African descent developed throughout the West Indies. Uh-oh, here they come. But first, watch this. The same was true in the continental colonies. There was a critical difference, however, in the resulting proportion of the total free population constituted by persons of some degree of African ancestry. In the continental plantation colonies and in the upper South and lower South states of the United States in the period 1700 through 1860, free African Americans never constituted as much as 5% of the free population. Their proportion reached its high point, 4.8%, in 1830, but in the two antebellum decades, it declined appreciably to 3.1%. By contrast, in Jamaica, which had more than half the total population of the British West Indies and of the total free population as well, free persons of color were 18% of all free persons in 1768, 36% in 1789, and 72% in 1834. The proportion in Barbados was 5% in 1786, 12% in 1801, and 34% in 1833 to 34. In the Leeward Islands towards the end of the 18th century, 1/4 of the free population was of some degree of African ancestry, which is a huge difference from what we saw with the American plantation. Most of those were still in the pit, right? Only a small amount were free people. Here we go. By the late 1700s, freedmen throughout the West Indies were working in artisan trades. In Barbados, the freedmen usually began as a hired unskilled worker, but quickly sought skilled work for which there was greater demand and which had a higher prestige value. Professor Shepard notes that by late in the 18th century, European freemen in that colony were able to practice their trades only to a decreasing extent, and as hucksters or the peddlers, they faced severe competition, as in other spheres, from the free coloreds. It seems to me that nothing could have prevented the development of a normal class differentiation within the African and Afro-Caribbean population of the British West Indies, as the freedmen came to constitute a substantial proportion of the free population. That was not the original intention when the sugar planters, for reasons of present profits, began to recruit their skilled labor force from the ranks of African bond laborers, and by land engrossment, meaning buying up all the land, made the flourishing of a European yeomanry, or the middle class, impossible. And remember, the elite bought up most of the land, and they were unwilling to give up some of it to the European laborers. And so Allen is saying that this is part of the reason that made it impossible to use the European laborers as the middleman, right? They couldn't afford any of the land. It was all bought up. Here we go. Although from time to time, they made legislated gestures toward reversing the trend, the need to make the highest possible rate of profit emptied such gestures of significance. In the British West Indies generally, the free colored included shopkeepers and owners of land and slaves. You see that? Now these free colored people were taking on the role of owning slaves. And this is why I say you have to understand that it's not a color thing. It's a character thing, right? Every human has the potential to become an agent for any type of idea, right? Even owning slaves, like we see is happening right now with the colored people doing it, right? Let's keep going. In the trade in non-sugar commodities with the North American colonies, Many free colored merchants traded directly with captains of cargo vessels. In Barbados, the energy and initiative of freedmen hucksters in meeting the bond laborers on the way to market and ships just arriving in the harbor enabled them to control the supply of produce and livestock to the general public. They were likewise involved in supplying sugar estates with essentials that could not be got from England. Indeed, this proved a route to sugar estate ownership by occasional foreclosure on a bankrupt creditor. 3 years after the repeal of the prohibition of freedmen acting as pilots, they had nearly monopolized Jamaica's coastal shipping. And so these freedmen were making themselves very involved in the economy, as we can see. In 1721, the Jamaican Assembly took a positive view of such trends, as it turned its attention to the problem of unsettled land becoming a receptacle for runaways and rebellious Negroes. And some of those runaways became known as the Maroons, and the colonial elite, they took notice of them. Let's continue. It occurred to them to establish a buffer zone between coastal sugar plantation regions and the mountainous and maroon-infested interior by offering free homestead to laboring class settlers and their families. Among the beneficiaries were to be every free mulatto, Indian, or Negro who would take up the offer and remain on the land for 7 years. Anyone that would raise their hand and say, yes, we will do this. Here you go. Each was to have 20 acres of land for himself and 5 acres more for each slave he brought with him. You see that? This is how they incentivized them to work on their behalf. Give them a few acres here and there and call it a day, right? This is the real deal here. Here we go. Perhaps some of those homesteaders served in the companies of free Negroes and mulattoes who were employed effectively in the First Maroon War, ended with the 1739 Treaty of Trelawney Town, binding the Maroons to capture and return runaway bond laborers. And Allen talks about it earlier in the chapter how some of the Maroons established these deals with the colonists that if any of these runaway Negroes were caught within that Maroon territory, the Maroons would capture them and take them back to the colonies, right? This was a little deal that they had working with each other. In exchange that those Maroons would be left alone, right? And left to the area to themselves. Here we go. By the early 1830s, free blacks and coloreds owned a total of around 310,000 bond laborers in Jamaica. When the militia system, based on European former bond laborers, proved a failure, the sugar bourgeoisie relied on the British Army and Navy to guarantee their control, while at the same time recruiting free persons, blacks and whites, into the militia as an auxiliary or an additional support. In Barbados, as in Jamaica by the 1720s, freedmen were required to serve in the militia, even though they were denied important civil rights. The British Army and Navy, however, were subject to many demands because of the almost constant worldwide round of wars with France that would last for 127 years, from 1688 to 1815. In the decisive moment, the coming of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, when all hung in the balance, more extreme measures were required, for then the British in the West Indies were confronted with blacks inspired by the revolutionary doctrine of French republicanism, and were forced to conduct operations against large numbers of rebellious slaves in the rugged and largely unknown interiors of their own islands of Grenada, St. Vincent, and Jamaica. The internal and external dangers were so critical that the British Supreme Commander in the Caribbean was forced to conclude that the army of Great Britain is so inadequate to defend these colonies without an army of black soldiers. 8 West Indian regiments were formed, composed in small part by freedmen and partly of slaves purchased by the army from plantation owners, but more were acquired directly from Africa. However, it was clear that continued existence of the West Indian regiments depended upon establishing the black soldiers as freedmen. Indeed, in 1807 it was so declared by the Act of British Parliament. The bond laborers who entered the British Army by that act became freedmen. But the logic of the policy represented a major violation of the principle of denial of social mobility of the oppressed group. Because the idea is that the people who are supposed to be oppressed, that oppressed class, is not supposed to have any type of mobility to the upward classes, right? You're supposed to be able to keep them down in a group together, right? And he's saying that this is violation of those ideas, right? Here we go. Many of these soldiers, when discharged, settled on plantations as free persons. In the meantime, thoughtful observers had begun to advocate the advantages to be had from a positive attitude toward freedmen in general. Now pay close attention to what's about to be said right now and what's coming up. Listen closely. Here we go. Consider advice put forward by 4 authoritative English writers: Edmund Burke, 1758, Edward Long in 1774, the Reverend James Ramsay in 1784, and George Pickard in 1803. Indubitably, meaning unquestionably, the security of every nation consists principally in the number of low and middling men of free condition, and that beautiful gradation from the highest to the lowest, where the transitions all the way are almost imperceptible. So he understood every nation to have its lower status people and its middle status people, or the buffer class. Now watch who he says is supposed to play those roles in his imagination. Here we go. What if in our colonies we should go so far as to find some medium between liberty and absolute slavery, in which we might place all mulattoes and such blacks who their masters should think proper in some degree to enfranchise? And so he imagined in his mind that all the mulattoes and some of the blacks who were worthy were to play this middleman position between the slaves, which are the other, those that are classified as blacks at the bottom, and the ones to experience liberty, who they're trying to carve out as the whites, right? And they're supposed to play this middle position to be the gatekeepers, to keep them down here, right? This is how these people were thinking, right? This is how they played the game. Let's get some more. These might have land allotted to them, meaning all the mulatto and some of the blacks, or where that could not be spared, some sort of fixed employment. Look how they're thinking. Here we go. The colony will be strengthened by the addition of so many men who will have an interest of their own to fight for. And so he wanted to give these middlemen some type of advantage, like having land or a fixed employment, so they would become attached to these incentives, and then they would have a reason of their own to defend the system. Now watch this, because it gets better. Here we go. Mulattoes, said Long, ought to be held in some distinction over the blacks. They would then form the center of connection between the two extremes, producing a regular establishment of 3 ranks of men. These are the written records coming from these people's minds and letting us know exactly what they were plotting on doing, right? Long, he wanted to place the mulattoes in the middle of the 2 extremes. What are the 2 extremes? Black on the bottom, white at the top, which gives 3 ranks of men, like he talked about. White at the top, mulattoes at the middle, and the blacks all the way down in the grave. Here we go. Reverend Ramsay, too, limited his proposal to mulattoes. The girls should be declared free from their birth, or from the time the mother became free. Male mulattoes should be placed out as apprentices to such trade or business as may best agree with their inclination and the demands of the colony, and should be freed at the age of 30. He was persuaded that, by these means, a new rank of citizens placed between the black and white races would be established. You see that? These people were crafting the human consciousness, and they were using them to play certain roles within the society. They're playing a game at a high level, right? And so they were shaping the society and making sure that humans came out identifying, thinking, and behaving in certain ways. And so the mulatto in that society was molded so he can be the one to dim the lights of the blacks, so they couldn't find their way on the path. Here we go. They would be an intermediate buffer social control stratum, since they would naturally attach themselves to the white race and so become a barrier against the designs of the blacks. That's what the good Reverend wrote in 1784. They were going to use the mulatto as a tool to oppress the blacks. And when do we ever learn this in school? Never, because they don't teach this, right? Although they have the written records. What happens is they teach people a carefully crafted narrative that keeps people growing up and assuming a certain role and status within the society to keep the social system alive. Now let's keep reading. Pinkard argued for the social promotion of a considerable proportion of the people of color between the whites and Negroes. The installation of such a middle class would save Britain a great expenditure of life and treasure. The middle class would soon become possessed of stores and estates, and the garrison might be safely entrusted to them as the best defenders of their own property. So he was another one that understood the importance of the buffer class. This is how they played the game. And there's many more that are just like them, who are in positions of power, who also have the knowledge, who live today. Here we go. In 1803, John Elaine Beckles, Anglo-Barbadian member of the Barbados Council, denounced the limitation of property rights of freedmen. And why did he want to remove the limitation of property rights for freedmen? Was it because he felt bad for them and he wanted equality? Or was it for some other reason? Let's find out. Such property ownership, he argued, will keep them, the free colored, at a greater distance from the slaves, and will keep up that jealousy which seems naturally to exist between them and the slaves. That's why he wanted to remove the property limitation. He wanted to make sure that there was a clear distinction between the free colored and the black slaves, and he wanted to maintain a tension between these two people. Here's what else he said. It will tend to our security, for should the slaves at any time attempt a revolt, the free colored persons, for their own safety and the security of their property, must join the whites and resist them. You see that? To protect the whites and to fight on their behalf, just in case the slaves decided to resurrect from the dead and cut them off from being a nation. Now watch this. But if we reduce the free colored people to a level with the slaves, they must unite with them and will take every occasion of promoting and encouraging a revolt, which is a valid prediction based on the understanding of human nature and human psychology, which is what he was basing that prediction on. And so we have to remember also that at this time, there was way more people of African descent on the island. So at this time, they had to play the game wisely, and they had to create the necessary division, right, at the right point with the right people, right? Let's continue. Such ruling class insights recognize the link between concessions to the freedmen and the maintenance of control over the bond laborers, who in the late 1770s outnumbered the total free population of Barbados by nearly 3.5 times, and outnumbered by 9 times that of Jamaica. Just like we talked about, there were way more slaves than free people. So the right moves had to be played in this game that they have set up. Let's continue. As members of the militia that quelled or pacified the 1816 bond laborers' revolt in Barbados, the free colored were reckoned to have conducted themselves slightly better than the whites. In Jamaica in the First and Second Maroon Wars, the mulatto militia justified the expectation that they would be a powerful counterpoise of men dissimilar from the Maroons in complexion and manners, but equal in hardiness and vigor, capable of scouring the woods on all occasions, a service in which the British Army regulars are by no means equal to them. As the struggle to end slavery entered its critical stage, there were freedmen who supported the cause of the bond laborers, but there were exceptionally few. By the late 1770s, in Jamaica, 36% of the free population was composed of persons of some degree of African ancestry. On the eve of emancipation in 1833, there were a 72% majority. In Barbados in 1786, only 5% of free persons were persons of African ancestry. In 1833, there were 34%. Although this increase in the freedmen population brought added forces to the intermediate social control stratum against the bond laborers, it conversely became a major factor in the final crisis of the system of chattel bond servitude, coming as it did in the larger context of the Haitian Revolution, in which the role of the free colored had been decisive, and the rise of the abolition movement in England. And so in the rest of the chapter, he ends up talking about how this system eventually eroded, and how certain members of the colored class became supporters of the abolition movement. And he also talks about how the rest of the colored, they eventually came to support the freeing of the slaves, especially being assured that they would be compensated by the British for their loss in human property. But the important thing for us to understand is how these people in the positions of power were able to establish these systems of oppression by taking certain members and giving them rights while denying it to the others. And so we have the records here which show us how they were thinking and why it is that they were doing the things that they were doing. And these people went to the extent of using skin color, religion, and whatever tool that they needed to take advantage of the people for their own personal gain. And the thing is, we still have people today with these same desires. And this is what we have to understand. And we also have to understand and know how to detect it. And so hopefully you have been given some extra light to find your way on the path. And this video has been helpful to you. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael. And I'll see you in the free world.